The winters of the Second World War weren't just cold, they were life-threatening. Entire communities were cut off from supply lines, families were forced to adapt with whatever they had, and survival became a day-to-day calculation. When you dig into first-hand accounts, diaries, and post-war interviews, a clear pattern emerges. The people who made it through weren't necessarily the strongest, but the most adaptable. And that's exactly why these old methods still matter. They weren't theory. They were used by real families who endured cold seasons far harsher than anything most modern households will ever see. If you're interested in survival history with real substance, not recycled myths, these methods show the level of ingenuity everyday people relied on. Techniques you can still apply today, whether you're preparing a homestead, studying wartime resilience, or simply appreciating the discipline that kept civilians alive under brutal conditions. Let's get straight into the 4 core strategies that repeatedly appear in credible WWII civilian survival accounts and break down how they worked, why they worked, and how they can still serve someone today. Families survived deadly winters by mastering fuel rationing through controlled microheating techniques. Fuel shortages were universal during WWIIs. In Eastern Europe and parts of Scandinavia, coal deliveries stopped entirely. Even in Western Europe and Britain, governments placed strict quotas on coal, wood and kerosene. Families couldn't heat entire homes, so they adopted what many diaries refer to as microheating. Instead of trying to warm the house, they warmed people and small spaces. Homes were consolidated into a single warm room. Families sealed unused rooms with blankets, rags, or even stuffed newspaper into door cracks. Some dug small alcoves into basements or converted storage spaces into heat pockets, because a tiny area was easier to warm with minimal fuel. Cooking became strategic. Meals were prepared during the coldest parts of the day, so stoves pulled double duty, feeding the family and heating the room. A modern application is straightforward. If you ever face a grid failure in winter, heating a reduced footprint is exponentially easier than trying to warm your entire home. You can replicate this by selecting one well-insulated room, sealing drafts with towels or foam strips, and running a single safe heating source, such as a wood stove, propane heater, or even a candle-powered clay pot heater. The method still works because the physics haven't changed. Small spaces heat faster, retain warmth longer, and require a fraction of the fuel. Food scarcity was overcome through fermentation route storage and heat-free preservation methods. Winter food shortages during the Second World War were often worse than the cold itself. Refrigeration wasn't common, canning supplies were limited, and electricity during bombardments was, well, unreliable. Families leaned heavily on low-tech preservation fermentation, dehydration, near heat sources, salt curing, and root cellaring. Fermented krauts, pickled vegetables, and sour soups were nutritional lifesavers across Eastern Europe and Russia. These foods required no heat, no refrigeration, and provided essential vitamins that prevented deficiencies during months without fresh produce. Meanwhile, root cellars, either dug into the ground or converted from old storage pits, kept potatoes, carrots, beets and turnips edible well into late winter. Even in bombed-out cities, families improvised cellars using buried barrels lined with straw or sand to stabilize temperature and humidity. Applying this today doesn't require wartime conditions. If you want a reliable survival buffer, start with foods that store themselves without modern conveniences. A simple root cellar can be made by burying a large trash bin in the ground, covering it with soil, and using straw layers to insulate produce. Fermenting vegetables requires nothing more than salt, water, and a jar. These techniques give you a winter pantry that stays stable even during power failures. Clothing became survival gear through layering, insulation hacking, and fabric recycling. Cold resistance wasn't about having the best coat, it was about modifying whatever clothing was available. Military-grade wool rarely reached civilians, so families reworked old garments into insulating layers. They lined coats with spare fabric-stitched blankets into makeshift cloaks and packed newspaper between inner and outer layers to trap warm air. In the Netherlands, wartime fashion journals even suggested sewing strips of worn clothing into quilted liners to reduce heat loss. Wool was prized because it remained warm even when damp, but most didn't own enough of it. Cotton garments were worn closest to the skin to wick moisture, while thicker recycled materials created loft and insulation. The result was a layered system that, honestly, rivaled what modern outdoor gear companies now call thermal stacking. You can apply this directly. In any cold weather emergency, insulation equals trapped air. Layer a moisture-managing base, add thick middle layers, and increase loft with blankets, quilts, or even crumpled paper in a pinch. The principle that saved families in the 1940s is, well, identical to the principle that keeps mountaineers warm today. Water access was maintained through controlled thawing and careful contamination avoidance. Winter didn't eliminate water problems, it created new ones. Pipes froze, wells iced over, and urban residents often relied on melted snow. But, melting snow without method can lead to illness, because snow is mostly air and often contaminated with soot, ash, or debris. Lucy families use slow-thaw techniques, melting in covered pots to prevent falling ash, combining snow with a small amount of liquid water to speed the process, and always boiling before use. Families living under bombardment regularly collected roof runoff during brief thaws, storing it in sealed containers tucked against indoor walls to prevent freezing. Rural families broke ice on wells daily to prevent total freeze-over, sometimes using heated stones to keep access points open. Today, the practical takeaway is that snow should never be relied on without treatment. The correct method still mirrors wartime practice. Add a small volume of clean water to snow in a pot, melt gradually, and boil the result. A modern twist is using insulated containers to prevent refreezing, exactly as wartime households did with ceramic or wooden vessels placed near heat sources. Every one of these strategies comes from people who had no choice but to adapt under pressure. Their methods weren't theoretical, they were proven through necessity. If you appreciate hard history and real survival knowledge, these lessons hold tremendous value. For more deep dives into authentic historical survival techniques, subscribe to Legacy of Survival and share this guide with others who appreciate serious, evidence-based history.